Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh Brevi, and you're watching our weekly flagship show, The Talking Point. Welcoming our guest for today from Washington, D.C., and welcoming all our viewers who are watching us live and those who will see this program once it's recorded, Professor Catherine Fair. She's a professor of peace and security studies at the Georgetown University, the Edmund Ward School of Foreign Services. Professor Fair, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Professor Fair, just looking at the latest situation in Afghanistan, and now the fifth province in the west, Herat, the big one, has gone. And not only that, Ismail Khan, who we know for decades now, has either surrendered or been detained. He's in the custody of the Taliban. How do you see the Taliban movement over the last weeks after Biden announced his plan to withdraw?
Well, I mean, I don't know why people are saying that they were surprised. I mean, I for one, have been saying this going back now for some time. The so-called peace negotiations were really nothing but an opportunity for the Taliban to regroup, to plan for this eventual assault upon Afghanistan, to stash weapons. We've seen this a lot, right? The Tamil Tigers did this after it had entered into some sort of peace process with the Sri Lankan state in 2002. So it's not uncommon that groups will use the guise of a so-called peace process to actually disguise what they were actually doing. What I find absolutely unfathomable is that U.S. intelligence did not detect this. I know for a fact that there have been U.S. intelligence estimates that put the decline of Kabul within 6 months of the full troop withdrawal. So from that point of view, the Taliban are actually way ahead of schedule. But to say that this wasn't expected it's simply untrue. But I think the most frustrating thing is that Biden isn't like George W. Bush, who came into the region not knowing anything. He was, in fact, Barack Obama's vice president. And he was the beneficiary of countless briefings about the nature of the Taliban and the important role that Pakistan played. So he's not coming into this ignorant. He's actually doing this with forethought, and he is doing this in the belief that this is good for U.S. policy. Lisa Curtis yesterday on NDTV said something extraordinary. The United States is actually begging the Taliban that it not attack the U.S. embassy. So, this is a disaster that could have been prevented at so many different opportunities had the United States done what it should have done 15 years ago, which is put sanctions on Pakistan. I'm not saying, blanket sanctions against the country, but targeted sanctions like the kind that we have long applied to shape Iran's behavior, right? I'm speechless. This is a defeat that everyone saw coming who was paying attention. And the people that were responsible for preventing it have consistently, over and over, abdicated authority. They just think the Pakistan problem is too hard. And then I think more sinister yet is that there's a lot of people in the U.S. government, and quite frankly, the citizenry don't have an opinion. The citizenry are generally clueless. They just don't think Afghanistan is our problem anymore. And this is exactly the thinking that they had in 1990 when they handed over our policy to the Pakistanis. Mark my word, it is very much our problem.
This problem, and you were mentioning Lisa Curtis and what Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad is doing in Doha, apparently with the Taliban, that is asking for some kind of assurances that the American embassy is not targeted. We heard what happened after that, 3,000 troops being moved to secure the Kabul Hamid Karzai airport. But in total, It's about 8,000 military personnel who will be moved into the area, not just in Afghanistan, Qatar, Kuwait, the quick action force as well. But Professor Fair, before I come to you on that, I just want to play out what the Pentagon spokesperson said when you specifically asked about the parallels with what happened in 1975 in Saigon in Vietnam. This is what Kirby had to say.
The evacuation of civilian by the military will look like, and how are you going to avoid a parallel with the fall of Saigon?
What this is going to look like is what it is, Sylvie, and that's the United States government looking after the safety and security of our people, first and foremost, and making sure that we, the military, are supporting the safe movement of these individuals out of Afghanistan, as I said, which we believe is a prudent step. We're not walking away from our commitment to the Afghan forces. We're not completely eliminating our diplomatic presence on the ground.
Professor Fair, before I get you to respond, I can see you shaking your head. Just one of our viewers, Sandeep Nadkarni, is saying, delighted to hear Professor Fair missed her insight, candor, and humor during her YouTube hiatus. So welcome back. And your reactions to what Ms. Kirby had to say.
Just disgust. This is the worst of America, where we only care about ourselves. You know, I am unable to say without completely getting choked up. The tens of thousands of Afghans that worked with us for the last 20 years, we have been able to bring only a few thousand of them to the United States. You know, Afghans, they tend to have large families. So when we're talking about, 20,000 Afghan applicants who deserve, this is their entitlement for risking their lives, for working with us for as long as they did. We're also talking about a family size of 6 to 7, and often there's elderly dependents. So we're talking about a huge number of Afghans and their families that we are abandoning to die. And this Kamina, because that's the most generous word I have for him, only says that we have an obligation to Americans, not the 20,000 and more Afghans that risk their lives. And that's just those who worked directly with the Americans, right? There are many tens of thousands more who worked with multilateral institutions as well as our NATO and non-NATO partners, not to mention, Afghan national police forces, Afghan national, other Afghan national defense forces whose families are being picked off. And all he can talk about is evacuating the embassy. That is the worst of America. That is the worst. And he doesn't have any shame about it.
So you do see this having parallels in terms of it's not just the military that it's leaving now. You're asking for, America is asking for the Taliban not to attack its diplomats, creating a corridor with 3,000 more troops, which is what? 4 times the amount that they want to keep their 650 to protect the embassy.
So, I'm not a scholar of Vietnam, right? I teach aspects of the Vietnam War.
True.
But I would say this is actually worse than what we saw in Saigon, subject to my limited knowledge, because what we saw in Saigon is that we were also trying to evacuate the South Vietnamese who worked with us, right? The people that were on those helicopters, those last helicopters, weren't just Americans. They were our South Vietnamese partner. What the U.S. government right now is doing is saying, sorry, Afghans, we know you risked your lives. You risked everything to work with us these last 20 years. Get in line, and maybe, ik din jaiga, when you will get your visa. Right. So this is actually worse than 1973. And I think the ferocity that we are going to see in coming days, weeks, and of course months, because I anticipate Kabul to fall almost immediately. The Taliban have just taken advantage of this peace process to stock up. And it's not just I'm tired of talking about them as if they're independent actors. This is Pakistan via the Taliban, right? They're not an insurgent group. They are a fully owned subsidiary of Rawalpindi. So the kinds of revenge killings, the massacres that we're going to see, it's going to be unparalleled to the previous tenure of the Taliban, because the Afghanistan that the Taliban are seeking to squash is a much more modernized Afghanistan. These young people for the last 20 years, women and girls in particular, they've grown up expecting a different future. Right. And they're going to have to knock those women and children down a lot further than they had to in the 1990s. It is, I can't even imagine the bloodbath that we are about to see ensuing in Afghanistan.
This bloodbath, I just wanted to look at how the Taliban have this time approached taking Kabul for the second time from 1992. Instead of coming from Kandahar, and it took them, 2 years, from 94 to 96. This time it's in the north, in Badakhshan, in areas, bordering Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, where they started. They went down south, of course, Kandahar, Ghazni, and the west. So how do you really read their strategy, the military strategy first, Professor Fay?
So I wouldn't know how to begin to answer that question. But what does strike me is essentially what they have is that they have this encirclement strategy, right? So they're not coming from one direction. They are exercising influence in capitals that they didn't really have a lot of control over in the past. But I mean, let's take Kunduz, for example. The Taliban have been fighting for Kunduz for many, many years. I was an election observer in Kunduz in 2009. And it's funny how people don't actually pay attention to history. They had been trying to take Kunduz now going back to 2009 and in fact earlier. And that's just one example of them kind of picking a strategic target and achieving it. But what you said, I think, is correct, right? They're not coming unidirectionally from the particular Pashtun groups that Taliban 1.0 drew from. They're coming in from all over the country. And there's just so many issues here, right? For one thing, the United States is patting itself on the back that it built this very large Afghan national army. The problem is that this army is not sustainable, right? We put them on U.S. weapons. U.S. weapons are the worst thing. We miserably failed to create an Afghan Air Force, again, because we wanted them to use our platforms, not the platforms that were most appropriate for Afghanistan, which, quite frankly, were Russian platforms. And then we built into this system, and I think this is so important. So many Americans will complain about corruption in Afghanistan and as a justification for washing their hands of it. But the United States, literally from the first months of being in the country, the end of 2001, began building in this massive corruption, right? And we thought that if the government was corrupt, we would more easily be able to control it. So from the beginning, we baked into the government this massive inability to provide services without huge degrees of industrial strength corruption. And then, that's sort of on the front end, this problem that's percolated and proliferated over the last 20 years. But then at the back end of this, during the Trump administration, and this was something that President Biden continued with, they were putting all of their efforts trying to delegitimize Ashraf Ghani, right? They were trying to force him to step down, to create some sort of government that was inclusive of the Taliban. I mean, it's just preposterous that we would try to.
They're still trying to get him to step down.
They're still trying to do this, right? I mean, this is classic negotiations with terrorists. I mean, so from beginning to end, and I mean from beginning, we can have a lengthy discussion. I would argue that one of the worst things that the United States ever did was believe Pakistan in 2001, right? We went to war with the country that was singly dedicated to undermining each and every one of our efforts there. And at the same time, we were paying them, $30 billion, $40 billion. And that's what is on the records overtly. We don't know how much money Pakistan got covertly for choking up some Al-Qaeda number 3 whenever Condoleezza Rice or Hillary Clinton ended up in Pakistan. So by not recognizing, I mean, the U.S. went through all of these initiatives like the surge, and I argued strenuously against the surge, not because I didn't think we needed more troops, but ironically, the reason why we were losing was because of Pakistan, and the surge made us more dependent upon Pakistan. What we actually needed was a reconfigured, lighter footprint, more dependent upon air corridors and ground corridors, so that we could have sanctioned Pakistan, right? But you will have seen over the last 20 years, I'm the only person who consistently and vocally talks about sanctioning Pakistan. Even Lisa Curtis, who is almost as hawkish as I am, won't even mention it.
Just going into what Vivek Yadav, one of our viewers, saying, how is Pakistan avoiding getting a rap for harboring not just the Taliban, but 22 other groups, despite stark evidence of it? When the Taliban leaders fly into Qatar, they're doing so by flying in from Islamabad and Karachi. That's not the only thing we've seen. Osama bin Laden, we've seen other Taliban
Mullah
leaders.
Omar.
Mullah
Omar. I mean, there's the Miran Shah Shura, there's the Quetta Shura, the Karachi Shura, the Peshawar Shura, there's the Pindi Shura. So look, I share your readers, your viewers' question. I mean, I've been asking people this for so many years. That's actually why I took a YouTube hiatus. It's also why I took a hiatus from writing editorials in English, because I just found it to be so exhausting to constantly say the same thing and to hear the constant response that, oh, we can't sanction Pakistan. Pakistan is too important to sanction. And this is unfortunately, which I think is largely incomprehensible to just about every one of your viewers, and it's incomprehensible to me, and I live here. The Pakistanis have convinced the United States, but also I have to say the British, that Pakistan is too big to be punished, too big to be sanctioned. It's too dangerous to fail. And that's why, for example, you have FATF, right? FATF should have been designated as a on the blacklist, but once it's put on the blacklist, it can't get IMF funding, and that will create economic hardship for Pakistan. So the United States and Britain, they are the ones who work behind the scenes to make sure that Pakistan gets a gray listing rather than the black listing that it deserves. We have laws on the books that we're supposed to bring about strenuous consequences if Pakistan is found to be supporting the Jaish-e-Mohammed. And look, you just had a picture of Moeed Yusuf. Let's talk about this for a second. For years, I called him an ISI asset. And do you know what the response was? My colleagues tried to get me fired from Georgetown, right? The Pakistanis have been so capable and competent at cultivating the think tanks in Washington, D.C. Marvin Weinbaum at the Middle East Institute has taken directives from the Pakistan embassy to not invite me or Hussein Haqqani. Seema Sarohi did a piece on this. It just sounds incredible, but it's true. I am banned from speaking at my own National Defense University at the demand of Pakistan. Let that sink in. My own National Defense University. We have Michael Kugelbacha at the Wilson Institute. He doesn't say anything negative, and the Pakistanis don't have to pay him a cent, right? It's just by the benefits of giving him visas and the red carpet. He'll happily acquiesce. They fly him on helicopters to Waziristan, and then he can say fabulous things like, oh my goodness, the progress in Waziristan. So there's been a very effective
further, Professor.
It's an information operations. It's an IO.
What exactly binds the US, Keshav asked, with Pakistan, despite what you say is the latter's involvement in anti-US interests? Are they a pursuit and not actually a U.S. interest?
So like I said, I mean, it is the United States believes this problem is too hard and it acquiesces to Pakistan, right? So it's like, you've got this really horrible child, he kills kittens, and you're afraid of punishing him because he might try to kill you. So Pakistan has used its nuclear weapons, quite frankly, to deter the United States from taking meaningful action against it. coupled with on the ground a very effective information operations campaign. So the people that I mentioned, these are consequential people. When the New York Times wants to do a story on the Taliban, they call Michael Kugelbucha, or they call Marvin Weinbaum, or any of these other myriad persons who essentially argue on behalf of Pakistan. This is why in US media you do not see these frequent linkages between the Taliban and the Pakistanis, right? And then when they are cited in these newspaper articles, they're then called on television programs. And they are essentially the de facto interlocutors for Pakistan, right? And they're not going to say, well, this is all Pakistan's doing. What they're going to say instead is that, this is the failures of the United States, which is true. But our failures, our principal failure has not been in Afghanistan. It has been in Pakistan. And that's just within the United States. The United Kingdom has a much more problematic calculus because British Pakistanis are a really important, vote bank, to use the lexicon that's popular in India. The British have long loathed to crack down on British Pakistani activism. They actually let Jaish-e-Mohammed's leader, Masood Azhar, do a fundraising tour in the United Kingdom. Can you imagine anything so preposterous?
The UK is totally a different ballgame. Let me just put out what the US
it's an important ball game.
Yeah, true. But we could have a whole complete show on that. We heard what the Defense Secretary Wallace is saying. I just want to play out what the US official line is in terms of so-called sticks and carrots. And this is what the US State Department spokesperson Ned Price had to say about not just the US, but he claimed the whole international community, with everybody who's in Doha. That's not just the extended Troika, but all the Central Asian countries, China, Russia, India, were all on the same page. This is what Ned Price had to say on how the US is planning to deal, at least publicly, with the Taliban continuing its military offensive.
That they will not recognize any government that is imposed through military force. So this is not just the United States making this point. This is not just the United States speaking with our voice. This is the international community, as you see represented in the consensus that has emerged today regarding this very simple point. Any force that seeks to take control of Afghanistan with the barrel of a gun, through the barrel of a gun, will not be recognized, will not have legitimacy, will not accrue the international assistance that any such government would likely need to achieve any semblance of durability.
Professor Fair, there are already reports that China is saying, or source-based reports, I don't know whether it's true or not, that China will recognize the Taliban if it comes to power. They have already had dealings with them for decades, even during their last, But how do you see the world, the international community? You have the United Nations Security Council, you have the 1988 Sanctions Committee. Is there anything that can be done, or is it's too late? You're saying the Taliban already behind what you thought their schedule for Kabul would be?
All right. So first of all, let's be clear. The Taliban do not care about international legitimacy. This is another fiction that the Americans have been spinning for years when they were trying to say, my question about these Doha negotiations was, why would they negotiate? They're winning, right? If you couldn't impose your military will upon them when you had 380,000 US and NATO troops, how could you impose your will upon them when you have 3,800 who are not even in direct combat roles, right? So the idea that the Taliban crave international legitimacy is just absurd. They don't need international legitimacy, right? Why? Not only do they have Pakistan, they have China, right? And as you noted, and you're one of the few people actually that I've heard say this, or who are knowledgeable of this, the Taliban and China had interactions well before 9/11, right? They had an agreement, right? And the Chinese were also close to an agreement with Osama bin Laden in a formal memorandum process. But there had already been a tacit agreement between bin Laden and China. That's why bin Laden never criticized the slaughter at the time of the Uyghurs, which was well underway in 2001. So what the Chinese are actually hoping for is that the Taliban will come into power, because that certainly creates a lot more facility with their Pakistani partners, because the Chinese have been the biggest investors in China, the largest single investors. Like, for example, the Ainat copper mine. They can't get those resources out of the ground and into market without the Taliban. So, and of course, the Chinese, they don't care who's running Afghanistan as long as as long as it brings stability. It's very ironically, it's very similar to the United States position in the mid 90s, which was, the United States was really interested in these Unocal pipelines. Ahmed Khalilzad was very much involved in that. I ended up being involved to some extent when I was at RAND. We were on a Unocal project. So I had glimpses into this, and we were completely okay with recognizing the Taliban as the de facto power, because we thought that that would bring stability that would allow these American companies to build these pipelines. So the position that the Chinese are taking is really similar to what the U.S. position was in the mid 1990s. They're looking for stability for profit. And the stakes for the Chinese are, of course, a lot higher, because this is a part of the One Belt, One Road initiative, or BRI, I guess it's been rebranded. So international legitimacy, what a
In keeping
joke.
with that, Mehul Lad has a question: with Moscow and Beijing embracing and legitimizing the Taliban, does the US's threat of isolating the Taliban hold any water?
So here's what I do anticipate, right? So Russia and China are obviously completely willing to work with the Taliban. But when the United States withholds humanitarian aid from a country, who suffers? Not the leaders, because the leaders have these beneficiaries, right, in Moscow and Beijing. And let's not forget Pindi. And I'm saying Rawalpindi, not Islamabad, deliberately, not by accident. So what international aid is actually going to do, it's going to punish ordinary Afghans who are already going to be in a world of hell. And ironically, that's going to make them more dependent upon the Taliban, and any modicum of relief from the immiseration that they've imposed, the Taliban can provide, is actually going to engender more public will to support them. Right. So it's a self-defeating goal, essentially, that ultimately isn't going to matter to anyone except the Afghans.
Sure. I mean, it's that cliche overused and wrongly used. I would say the graveyard of empires is actually a graveyard of Afghans over the years. But, so, are you saying FATF,
Yes.
UN Security Council, there is nothing that can be done now to stop the Taliban?
Well, I mean, had these sanctions been applied 10 years ago, possibly,
Maybe.
right? So at this point, I do think there needs to be immediate sanctions on Pakistan. These are sanctions of punishment, and they will also be sanctions of deterrence. But then how do you deal with the massive bloodbath that's going to ensue? It's the international community is saying, well, we have to deal with the incoming humanitarian disaster. Well, how are you going to deal with the incoming humanitarian disaster? How are you going to deal with that? What can you possibly do? So I think it was Rakesh Sood yesterday who said, you can maybe swim in a river, but you can't swim in a flood. So I find I don't, this morning, I don't have any, there's no panacea that is going to unscrew this situation for the Afghans. I mean, what can the U.S. possibly do? I'll tell you what the U.S. should have done, and I've joked about it repeatedly on social media. We should have shot every single one of those Kaminas at Doha when we had them all in a room.
Right, but so seriously, the international community.
I am serious. I mean, we
No,
forced Ashraf
you are
Ghani
kidding.
to release 5,000 murderers.
Prisoners. Yeah,
And
the Taliban says one of the conditions hasn't been met because they want another 5,000 or so released. But they're releasing prisoners from wherever they're going. How do you see India's role in Afghanistan, and how do you see it dealing with the situation currently?
Well, look, I mean, I'm sure you probably have already gotten most of your people out of the country, would be my guess. If I were the Indian government, I would have already been evacuating, because in my experience, the Indian intelligence on Afghanistan has always been better, because the way in which India operates in Afghanistan, I mean, they don't hide behind Fortress America, right? The Indians have always been much more, what's the word I'm looking for? Much more risk acceptant, right? They're interacting with Afghans very openly. The Americans don't do that. Afghans have to come to the embassy to interact with them. So I've always found that the Indians have had a much better understanding of Afghanistan, and based upon that, I'm sure that you guys have been well ahead of the curve. But I think that India's options are going to be really, really constrained, right? I don't see how India can operate effectively without some kind of security umbrella. Yeah. And, Rakesh Sud talked about negotiating with the Taliban. Well, I really respect Ambassador Rakesh Sud. I have nothing but the highest admiration for him. But I don't know what there would be to talk about, right? I mean, the Taliban lie. Right? What would the Taliban do for India? So
you don't subscribe to those analysts who say that there is a possible wedge that can be driven between groups of the Taliban. Taliban is, or some of them are, waiting to get out of GHQ or Rawalpindi or ISI's hands.
Yeah, and those people are actually the most dangerous. Right. They're the most dangerous because there's a reason why they want to get away from GHQ. It's because GHQ has control over their families, right? So many of these Taliban Kaminas, their families are in Pakistan. And the Pakistanis may not exercise positive control, which is you are going to do this, but they do exercise negative control, which is to say, if you do this and we don't want you to do it, your family is going to suffer. Right. So the fact that the Pakistanis have some control is actually a good thing, because if we could find some way of sanctioning Pakistan, right, and bringing Pakistan to heel, we could rely upon this sort of cascade of coercion. So I'm not someone who thinks, divide and rule is a long-standing tradition in South Asia, thanks to the British. But the consequences of divide and rule is that instead of having one group that you have to monitor, control, and manage, you then have to deal with these multiple fissures. And you have to basically, you're no longer playing one instrument, you're playing a whole orchestra. So I'm not someone who finds divide and rule to be a compelling strategy. I just see where it has failed. I would love someone to tell me, here's an example of where it's worked.
So again, when you're saying that realistically, it's unlikely that the international community, the US, the UN Security Council, FATF, would put any sanctions on Pakistan that would change the situation. So how do you see Pakistan responding to this situation that's developing in Afghanistan with the Taliban on the doors of Kabul?
So here's what I anticipate, right? This Pakistan is going to... So there's going to be a little bit of blowback, right? Because the Pakistani Taliban and Pakistan likes to float the idea that the Pakistani Taliban, the Afghan Taliban are एक ही चीज. They're not एक ही चीज. They're totally different things. So Pakistan is going to have some degree of internal security uptick, right? That they're going to have to deal with. But this is a huge victory for Pakistan, right? This is... the Indians are not going to be able to operate, not even out of their traditional strongholds, with the way in which the Afghans, the way in which the Taliban have been able to take over the country. So this is a huge victory for them. So what I actually anticipate is that the terrorism in India, which is sponsored by Pakistan, is going to resume, possibly. I mean, there's nothing compared to the levels of the 1990s. But I actually anticipate things are going to get a lot worse for India, because what Pakistan will do is it tries to deal with the internal security issues. It's going to do what it's always done, which is Jaish-e-Mohammed is the Ghar Wapasi program for wayward Pakistan Taliban. And they'll be given, three choices. You join the Jaish and go kill Indians, or you go help the Taliban or we're just going to kill you, right? And in the past, when given those choices, they've either chosen Jaish or they've chosen to go to Afghanistan. So I think that I don't see that the Taliban have anything but an interest of from maintaining their old ties with groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed, because they've served them so well. And then the other reason why it's so important, groups like the Sipe-Saba Pakistan, which is a chup chup chup.
I think he wants to, he has a voice, and he or she wants to say something as well.
ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਮੇਰਾ ਖਿਆਲ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਸ ਨੂੰ ਪਿਸ਼ਾਬ ਕਰਨਾ ਹੈ ਤਾਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਜਾਣਾ ਹੈ. Hey, chupa chupa chupa. Anyway, but if you can hear it, I can take her out.
No,
Okay.
no, go ahead.
So yeah, so the SSP has been Lashkar-e-Jhangvi. They've been the primary sources of ISIS contributions, Islamic State, because they share this really militantly anti-Shia agenda. What the Taliban are going to have to do, right, to deal with because many of the so-called Islamic State in Afghanistan, they're not really Islamic State. They're just pissed off Talibs, right, who are rebranding with a competitor. But one of the ways, if I were a Taliban commander, how I would deal with this is that I would go back to the root, which is SSP and LEJ, and I would try to rekindle the loyalty of those Deobandi groups to the Taliban and to Al-Qaeda. And you don't do that by disavowing ties to Al-Qaeda. You actually do that by reinvigorating them, because there is a huge difference between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And so exploiting that difference would be something that I think any sensible Taliban leader would do.
There was a security meeting in Kabul. There was a lot on social media, saying that Amrullah Saleh had fled and he had gone to Tajikistan. He was very much part of the security meeting with President Ghani. How do you see the Afghan security? And the decision was that they would fight, and the NDSF would stand up to the Taliban. How do you see that developing, seeing what's happening all across the country, and especially Ismail Khan in Herat?
So, I mean, the morale of the ANDSF is as low as it can be. And, it's always been low, right? There was I think it was around 2009, NATO used to publish these so-called placemats, which provided statistics on the ANDSF, which at the time was just called the ANDF. The ghost soldiers, right? There were people getting paid that weren't actually there. The defections, they were never able to recruit enough soldiers to replace the people that had been killed or who had left. So, this is not a new problem. I mean, this is a problem that really began when the United States insisted on an enormous Afghan national army, right? They really wanted to put quantity above and beyond quality. And the weapon systems, again, that we put them on made no sense, given that the ANA is largely illiterate, right? There are very few, and we spent very little time trying to teach them literacy, unlike the Russians. When the Russians were there, they sent tens of thousands of Afghans to the Soviet Union for education and training. Ironically, those Soviet-trained Afghans were some of our most important partners. So we didn't do any of the most effective things that the Russians did, while continuing to repeat some of the most ineffective things. And then I think another issue that no one wants to talk about is the pervasiveness of rape in the Afghan National Security Forces. This has been raised a number of times. We've seen in some of the so-called green on blue killings that some of the killings were motivated by the fact that American and our NATO allied soldiers were witnesses to rape within the Afghan National Army and then did nothing about it. So the ANA has just so many myriad problems, and to expect them that they were going to be able to manage themselves without air support, without the ability to do casualty evacuation, all of these things that, so for example, the Indian Army is capable of doing. The ANA has none of those capacities. So how are they going to manage this? It's really, I think that's the biggest lie here. Because anyone who knows anything about armies knows that the army can't deal with this without these
So,
backup resources. Well, not these enabling resources, not backup, these force multiplying resources.
there are so many questions coming in, and I can take this discussion all over because there is so much to discuss. But in terms of you looking forward, blowback to the US, to Pakistan, to countries like China and Russia, and how would it affect India?
So like I said, I mean, I anticipate these relationships with the Taliban that had always been there with groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed to return. It's going to be an important relationship. Lashkar-e-Taiba doesn't have a terrific
But do
relationship
you
with
see
the Taliban.
Afghanistan in a civil war kind of situation where there will be pockets of people who will be resisting the Taliban?
So I had thought that might be the case, but
Okay.
Afghans, they tend to figure out, and this is why the Taliban fell so quickly. Like, Afghans figure out pretty quickly who's going to win, and they want to be on the winning side. So if they anticipate, as it appears to be the case, that the Taliban are just walking through, they will simply defect to the Taliban rather than risk fighting a battle that they're going to lose. So that might be why we're not seeing a lot of sort of sui generis fighting. I mean, I expect there will be some in parts of the north, but so far, it looks like the Taliban are just having a cakewalk.
And the blowback to countries in the region and the US at some point of time?
So, I think that the Taliban first have to get their house in order, right? Which is, again, getting an iron grip on Afghanistan, killing all the people that cooperated with the US and NATO, I also expect mass murders of people that are in the current government. So there's going to be, a huge bloodbath that they have to contend with first in Afghanistan. If there's going to be any kind of international blowback, it's going to be from the transnational groups that the Taliban will most certainly harbor. So that's a little bit more difficult to foresee. What the Taliban will have concluded from this, right, is that the United States can throw everything at it and it can survive. So the kind of scenario where the Afghan Taliban were on the run for a while, it's probably not going to be something that the Taliban are going to take seriously as a threat, right? Because what they've concluded from this is that with their partners in Pakistan, and also Russia and also Beijing, they were able to outfox the Americans. So I'm not sure what kind of threat the Americans can put on the Taliban that would prevent them from harboring groups like Al-Qaeda. So it's hard to predict. I'm not someone who crystal ball gazes, because that's just not how I tend to operate. But I anticipate we're going to have to deal with this situation sooner than later.
And Pakistan itself, I mean, we've seen in so-called interview by a TTP commander, we've seen attacks on CPEC projects. What happens? What could happen there, even if you don't crystal gaze?
Well, I can happily crystal gaze there because the consequences are more clear. But this is what I will say: there was one period in time when the Pakistanis were actually afraid that these internal groups were of consequence, right? And that is when, you may recall, right before the so-called peace deal in SWAT, where the government said that, here, you can go have your Sharia government in SWAT. What made the Pakistan government, and more importantly, Punjabis, willing to make that agreement was, if you remember, many Punjabis were like, well, these Pashtun areas, they're not civilized anyway. And from the average Punjabi tends to have a very dim view of everyone who lives west of the Indus. And they're like, well, you can have your Sharia there as long as I can have my Sirpaya, my Halim in peace here in Lahore. But what the Taliban did, the Pakistani Taliban, they attacked Bunair, which is right on the border. And then they began a series of attacks within Islamabad, Rawalpindi, Lahore, and for many years I used to, jokingly call Islamabad Islamabom, because there were so many attacks in Islamabad, largely against the Frontier Corps, against the police. And when they began targeting the Punjab, that's when the army, and mobilized by Punjabi popular opinion, began taking the TTP seriously, right? So I think the TTP understand that that was a strategic overreach. So I don't expect that the TTP will resume operations as they did like around 2009, 10, and 11, because I think they know that if they keep their operations in Fatah and in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, that they will not trip the strategic red lines. And also here, this will give some justification to the crackdown that the Pakistani state has long been waging against the Pashtun Tahfuz movement. So renewed TTP activity in Fatah and KPK will align with things that the state has been lying about for some years now.
Professor Christine Fair, absolutely appreciate your time and experience. There's so many questions that are still coming in, but we're really happy that you broke your so-called hiatus on YouTube with Stat News Global.
All right. Thank you so much. I wish there were a better note to end on, but there just isn't one.
No, just on a completely different note, I'll let you go and take your four-legged friend out. I think he wants to.
I actually have 6 of them in the house. Che kutiyan mere ghar vich han. Che kutiyan.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's a zoo.
एक समय था जब मेरे पास 4 थे, पर अब दो ही हैं.
Oh, I'm sorry. They bring so much joy in our lives otherwise.
Absolutely.
All right.
We took a completely different turn from the topic of conversation, but thank you
Anand
again.
vich raho ji, Anand vich raho.
See you again soon.
All
thank
right.
you,
Bye-bye.
President. And thank all our viewers, those who watch this live, and I can see tons of comments and questions in there. I'm sorry I couldn't get Professor Fair to answer all of them, but we'll try and get more often. Do send in your feedback and follow us on social media. You can also help support Strat News Global financially. There's a link in the descriptor. You've been watching Talking Point on Strat News Global. I'm Amit Abrevi.